In the quiet winter of 1838, in the modest town of Saint-Jean-d'Angély, a child named Herculine Barbin was born, marked female at birth, yet destined to live between two worlds. History remembers her as a tragic figure, a brief flicker in the archives of 19th century France, rediscovered only a century later by Michel Foucault. But what if the world that confined her had instead chosen compassion? What if, from the first breath, Herculine had been allowed to live as herself, without shame, without erasure, without the crushing weight of conformity? What might France, and perhaps the very language of identity, have become? Good evening, dear friends. Tell me, where and when are you listening from tonight? Perhaps by the fire or in the soft quiet of an early morning. If you find solace in forgotten lives and the delicate art of imagining what might have been, I invite you to subscribe, to settle in, and to walk with me through the long corridors of time. The first light of Herculine's world was pale and diffused, filtering through the frost that veiled the windows of the small infirmary. The air smelled faintly of lavender and lye, the quiet murmur of nuns wrapping a new life in linen. Outside, the bells of Saint-Jean-d'Angély rang their winter song across the cobblestone streets, a rhythm as old as the town itself. The France of 1838 was a place between revolutions, between monarchs and republics, between superstition and science. It was also, like Herculine, caught between worlds. In our true history, the midwife, uncertain but pressured by the priest who stood nearby, declared the child female. A simple mark on a parish record, a letter F, would come to define a lifetime of sorrow and concealment. But let us turn the page differently, just slightly. In this alternate world, the midwife hesitates longer, guided not by fear of the church, but by curiosity. She has read, perhaps, the newly printed works of natural philosophers who speak of human variation without condemnation. Instead of deciding, she writes, "Sex indeterminate." 3 words, a small mercy, the difference between a secret and a possibility. The priest, surprised, asks what she means, and she answers softly, "God makes many kinds of souls, Father. Some he places gently between his own designs." He does not protest. Perhaps he sees in this fragile infant not confusion but grace. So it is recorded, not as scandal, not as defect, but as mystery. And that is how Herculine's life begins, wrapped not only in linen but in the rarest gift of all, permission. The convent orphanage where she is taken stands at the edge of a river, its stones warmed by centuries of prayers. The sisters there are austere but kind. In our world, they would have pressed conformity upon her, sewing her into the narrow garment of girlhood, teaching her to kneel, to obey, to silence the questions that rise naturally in the heart of anyone who feels different. But in this other time, the abbess, an aging woman named Mother Therese, chooses a gentler path. She remembers a sermon from years before, one that spoke of the Creator's infinite variety, and she tells her novices, "The Lord needs no help from us to arrange his designs. We are here only to love." So as little Herculine grows, she is not corrected when she climbs trees with the village boys or lingers in the fields too long. When the other children tease her for her voice, neither fully high nor low, the abbess hushes them. "Listen instead to its truth," she says. "There are many notes in God's music." And in that moment, what might have been the first scar becomes the first song. Her childhood, then, unfolds differently. Books are not forbidden to her. She learns Latin early, surprising the local priest with her understanding of both Cicero and the Gospels. In a quiet corner of the convent library, she finds the works of Buffon and the medical journals of Cuvier, filled with sketches of the body's complexity. Instead of fear, she feels wonder. "We are all variations of one great theme," she writes in a childish hand across a scrap of parchment. "Perhaps the theme itself is love." Sometimes she sits by the river with the older girls, watching sunlight ripple across the water. They talk of the future, of husbands, of vows, of faraway cities. Herculine listens, smiling, though she feels neither the call to marriage nor the peace of religious life. She senses another vocation waiting, undefined but luminous. In this world, the sisters do not scold her for her silence. They see thoughtfulness, not rebellion, and so she learns to live in questions. One evening, when she is 7, Mother Thérèse calls her to the garden. The air is cool and smells faintly of rosemary. "Child," the abbess says, "the world will ask you to explain yourself. Do not rush to answer. The truth of a person takes time to ripen." Herculine nods, not understanding fully, but the words stay with her. She will repeat them, years later, to a student of her own. The years pass gently. The convent bell marks the hours, the seasons turn, and the child who once startled the midwife grows into a thoughtful, curious being, unlabeled yet loved. The villagers, too, grow accustomed to her difference. They whisper less. The baker's wife sends her bread on feast days. The blacksmith lets her watch him work. In this France, small mercies accumulate quietly, like snow upon rooftops, softening what might have been harsh edges. And so, when Herculine turns 10, the priest writes to the diocesan office in La Rochelle, describing her as a child of uncommon spirit and understanding, whose nature defies simple classification. The letter, remarkable for its lack of fear, is kept in the parish records. No one knows it, but this single description will one day inspire a physician in Paris to reconsider the laws of registration themselves. But that is still far ahead. For now, the child sits at her window, watching the flicker of lamplight upon the cobbles. She feels something stirring inside her, not unease, but a longing to understand where she fits in the great tapestry she has been told is the work of God. She whispers to herself, "Perhaps I am not between worlds at all. Perhaps I am both." Outside, the wind shifts, carrying the scent of wet earth and the distant tolling of the evening bell. The candle beside her sputters, its flame bending in the draught. It seems to bow, then rise again, steady and calm. The light trembles, but does not go out, and so the flame of another possibility is lit. The candlelight that once glowed in her small room now expands into wider corridors, into echoing stone halls where footsteps and hymns mingle in soft, holy rhythm. By the time Herculine reaches her 7th year, the convent has become both her school and her sanctuary. The rhythm of the bell dictates her days, matins, study, chores, and prayer, each hour a verse in the poem of her young life. The abbess, Mother Thérèse, now older and slower in movement, still watches over her with quiet affection, often pausing to observe how the child absorbs the world with wide, contemplative eyes. The nuns call her Petite Lumière, little light, for there is something in her gaze that softens even the sternest heart. In our real history, the convent would have pressed upon Herculine a single mold, the modest, obedient girl who must hide her questions, her longings, her unplaceable discomfort. But here, in this altered time, the convent has chosen curiosity over fear. The abbess has encouraged her to pursue study beyond the Psalms and Catechism, allowing her access to the small but rich library, a place of infinite worlds bound between worn leather covers. There, she discovers not only theology, but the earliest whispers of natural philosophy. She reads the works of Rousseau and Diderot in cautious fragments, tucked behind the Psalter, learning to think in paradox. "We are born neither angels nor beasts," one sentence reads, and the misfortune of humanity is that it cannot remain simply human. She copies those words in her notebook, tracing each letter slowly, as if engraving them into her soul. In those quiet afternoons, beneath a shaft of light that filters through the stained glass window, she begins to sense her own life as an example of that very truth. a being neither one nor the other, yet entirely, wondrously human. Her teachers notice her quickness, her delicate penmanship, the way she writes her essays with the thoughtfulness of someone twice her age. The abbess, recognizing a mind too bright to be contained, petitions for her to continue her education beyond the convent's curriculum. In this world, the local bishop, an old scholar named Monseigneur Duval, is sympathetic to reform. He has heard the debates in Paris about women's education and the new rationalism. So, in a moment that will echo across generations, he grants permission for Herculine to study with the parish boys, reasoning that a soul such as hers deserves knowledge, not boundaries. And thus, she enters a new classroom, a place filled with chalk dust, restless laughter, and the scent of ink and wood. At first the boys tease her gently, unsure of what to make of this quiet companion who reads Latin with ease, yet blushes when addressed. But as the months pass, she wins them over with kindness and the quiet strength of her understanding. Her identity, still unspoken, undefined, no longer feels like a curse. It becomes instead a secret window through which she sees the world in greater colors than others can imagine. At home in the convent, the seasons move like prayers repeated. The sisters tend the garden, the roses bloom. And at night, in the hush before Compline, Herculine lies awake listening to the breathing of the world outside. Sometimes she dreams she is neither inside nor outside those walls, but walking between them, her feet touching two paths at once. The dream does not frighten her, it comforts her. She has learned from the abbess that there are lives meant to stand in the threshold, keeping both sides of the door in sight. When she reaches adolescence, the change within her body begins to stir confusion among the sisters. Her frame grows tall and angular, her voice lowers slightly, her movements lose the softness expected of young women. But in this alternate history, the abbess and Monseigneur Duval choose not to summon doctors or hide her away. Instead, they gather in quiet council and agree upon a simple truth. The Creator's work need not be understood to be respected. The word spreads softly through the convent like incense. No longer does Herculine feel the cold sting of shame. Instead, she is regarded as something rare, a visible reminder that the soul is not bound by form. Encouraged by their acceptance, she begins to write short reflections, small essays, really, about her experiences of belonging and solitude. In them, she writes not of struggle, but of discovery. The world, she pens one evening, tells us that difference is a deviation, but perhaps difference is the proof of creation's abundance. The abbess reads these lines in candlelight and weeps, not from sorrow, but from the recognition that wisdom often blooms in the most unexpected soil. Years pass, and Herculine becomes not only a student, but a teacher for the younger girls. Her lessons are gentle. She teaches them to read both scripture and poetry, to see the divine not only in heaven, but in the pattern of leaves, in the pulse beneath one's wrist. The convent, once austere, becomes known in the region for its unusual openness. Travelers who visit note that its atmosphere feels lighter, as though the air itself carries the calm of comprehension. But the world beyond the convent walls does not change as quickly. Outside, France is still ruled by men who debate science and soul as though they were rivals. Rumors reach even this quiet place. Rumors of moral panic, of authorities questioning the place of women in learning, of doctors claiming to measure morality through anatomy. The sisters listen, but their faith in the quiet miracle of their pupil remains unshaken. They have seen what understanding can do. They have watched peace grow where fear might have taken root. One afternoon, as sunlight pours through the cloister arches, Mother Thérèse calls Herculine to her side. Her hands tremble slightly now, age softening her strength. "Child," she says, "there will come a day when you must leave this place. Knowledge is a gift that demands to be shared. Promise me you will not let the world make you smaller than you are." Herculine takes her hand, feeling its warmth, and promises. That night she walks through the garden alone. the scent of lavender rising around her. The air hums with the sound of crickets and distant bells. She feels both blessed and burdened by her difference, aware that the safety of these walls cannot last forever. Yet for the first time, she does not fear the future. She feels ready to step beyond the boundaries of Saint-Jean-d'Angély, carrying within her the lessons of compassion and curiosity that shaped her youth. In her small room, she closes her notebook, snuffs out the candle, and whispers to the darkness, "Perhaps the truth waits not at the end of learning, but in the act of seeking." The night answers only with silence, deep and kind. And thus, the child who once prayed for clarity begins to seek truth instead. The soft chime of the convent bell fades into a new rhythm, the murmur of voices in a teacher's seminary near Poitiers, where Herculine has come to continue her studies. She is 17 now, her features caught somewhere between delicacy and strength, her presence composed, yet quietly radiant. The years of gentle guidance have shaped her into a being of grace and thoughtfulness, but the wider world is waiting, with all its contradictions. The seminary is a place of order and intellect, its classrooms filled with the scent of chalk and candle wax, its windows tall and pale. It is here that she first meets Sarah. Sarah is bright, quick to laugh, and possessed of that rare courage to speak kindness aloud. Her eyes are blue-gray, her hair drawn back in the modest style of a teacher in training. But when she smiles, the room changes temperature. Herculine feels it first as a small warmth, then as something uncontainable, like the slow dawn after a sleepless night. Their friendship begins in shared lessons, in the late hours when students linger over texts and trade quiet observations about philosophy and scripture. Herculine, more cautious, listens to Sarah's words as one listens to music, both to learn and to remember. They walk the convent gardens together, discussing Rousseau and Pascal, or sit near the fire in winter reading aloud from old poems. Sarah has a voice that turns even simple words into comfort. One evening, as rain falls steadily against the windows, Herculine finds herself watching the way the light rests on Sarah's face. For a moment, she feels suspended between joy and fear, aware that her heart is learning a language it has never been taught. And yet, in this alternate history, love does not come clothed in shame. The seminary, perhaps influenced by the liberal spirit that has grown quietly through reformist circles, allows affection to exist without suspicion. The principal, a thoughtful woman named Madame Delcourt, believes that companionship between teachers strengthens the soul. God's mercy, she says once, moves not only through the church, but through the tenderness we offer each other. So their closeness is not condemned. The two young women become inseparable, teaching together, sharing notes, tending the small garden behind the seminary. Herculine feels for the first time that she belongs not just to study or prayer, but to another heart. There is no name for it, and none is needed. Theirs is a quiet intimacy, woven through gestures, through laughter over shared ink-stained fingers, through the unspoken understanding that what they share defies boundaries, yet harms no one. But love, even in its purest form, changes how one sees the world. Herculine begins to write differently. Her journal entries, once filled with questions about identity, now carry an emerging philosophy of compassion. She writes, "To love another is to discover oneself reflected and expanded. The self, like a flame, is made visible only in its light upon another." These words, later copied by students, circulate beyond the seminary. They reach the ears of a visiting professor from Paris, who is struck by their wisdom and invites Herculine to submit her essays to a small literary journal. She hesitates, then accepts, and for the first time, her thoughts, her truth disguised within gentle prose, find their way into print. Outside the seminary, the world is shifting. France stands on the edge of modernization. The whispers of political reform mix with the scent of ink and machinery. The press spreads new ideas, some dangerous, some liberating. Herculine reads of women petitioning for access to universities, of doctors debating the mysteries of anatomy, of thinkers questioning whether morality resides in the body or in the soul. These questions mirror her own, and she begins to realize that her life, though lived quietly, is already part of a larger conversation she has yet to fully understand. Meanwhile, Sarah's affection deepens into something more tender than friendship, though they never name it as such. One spring evening, while the garden is heavy with lilac, she places her hand gently over Herculine's and says, "You see the world with both eyes open. Perhaps that is what the rest of us are missing." Herculine, unsure how to respond, simply nods. Later, alone in her room, she writes, "I did not know I was waiting until she touched my hand." The candle burns low, her shadow trembles on the wall. The flame seems to breathe with her, steady and alive. In this version of her life, the love between them is not discovered in scandal. Instead, it becomes known quietly among their peers, an open secret treated with a kind of reverent discretion. Some call it a rare friendship, others something deeper, but no one seeks to destroy it. The students learn from them, not only the art of teaching, but the grace of living honestly. Herculine and Sarah introduce lessons on empathy, encouraging their pupils to see beyond appearance and rank, to understand that dignity lies in every living soul. The seminary becomes known, in whispers, as the House of Gentle Truths. Still, the world beyond their gates grows restless. The church debates science with growing unease. Politicians argue over education and the rights of women. Herculine senses the tide of judgment that could, at any moment, turn upon her. And yet she does not retreat. The courage of love gives her strength. She begins corresponding with intellectuals in Paris, signing her letters simply H. Barbin. Her writings hint at a vision of humanity unbound by rigid distinctions, a plea for kindness born of her own existence. "We are all experiments in God's imagination," she writes. "The tragedy is not that we differ, but that we are forbidden to be whole." Sarah reads these words and weeps, not from sorrow, but from awe. She tells Herculine that her voice will one day change minds. Herculine smiles softly, knowing that such change, if it comes, will be slow. Still, in her heart, she feels a quiet certainty that love, lived honestly, is itself a revolution. As summer approaches, their days together grow fewer. The seminary prepares to assign its teachers to various schools across the region. Sarah is chosen for a post in Niort, and Herculine for a parish school near Angoulême. They spend their last evening walking by the river, the air heavy with the scent of wild mint. They speak little. When they part, Sarah presses a folded note into Herculine's hand. It reads simply, "Do not let the world make you smaller. There is room for you in the truth." Herculine keeps the note in her journal, beside a pressed lilac. The next morning, she departs with the dawn, the sound of the river echoing in her memory. The train moves slowly through the countryside, past fields of wheat and quiet villages, carrying her toward the next chapter of her life, a chapter where the questions she has long carried will no longer be confined to the margins of her notebooks. But for now, she closes her eyes and remembers Sarah's laughter, the feel of her hand in the spring air. The memory becomes a talisman, a promise that even in the world's cold gaze, she will not be alone in spirit. The flame of love has been lit, and it will burn quietly within her through all the years to come. And indeed, love once spoken aloud changes everything it touches. The whistle of the morning train fades into the hush of provincial air, and with it the hum of Herculine's new life begins. The small parish school near Angoulême is humble. 2 rooms with high windows, a narrow corridor that smells of chalk and damp wood, and a small garden where the children chase one another during recess. Here, she teaches reading, writing, and catechism, her voice carrying calm authority. The villagers, At first uncertain of this young instructor who seems neither nun nor worldly woman, soon come to respect her diligence and warmth. They call her Mademoiselle Barbin, though some find her manner unusual, gentle but firm, compassionate yet distant, as if her thoughts were always half a step beyond the visible world. It is in this quiet routine that the old questions return, not as whispers of confusion, but as insistent, sacred stirrings. Her body, no longer the obedient companion of childhood, begins to assert its truth more clearly. The long-suppressed reality of her physiology can no longer be ignored. Where once she accepted mystery, she now feels the call to definition, not because she seeks approval, but because she wishes to live without deception. In another history, this realization would have led her into despair and exposure. But in this alternate world, France is standing at the threshold of a gentler kind of enlightenment. The debates in Paris about natural science and law have softened the edges of dogma. Some physicians have begun to view ambiguity not as sin, but as variation. In the summer of 1858, Herculine requests an audience with the local magistrate. The townspeople murmur. Speculation stirs like wind through dry grass. They imagine she intends to leave the convent or perhaps take vows. Instead, standing in the magistrate's modest chamber with its heavy curtains and dust-scented air, she makes a declaration that will ripple far beyond the room. Calmly, clearly, she says, "I have lived as woman and as teacher, but nature and truth call me otherwise. I ask not for pardon nor for privilege, only that my life be my own." The magistrate, an aging man weary from years of bureaucracy, studies her face and finds no trace of deceit, only a quiet sincerity that disarms him. The moment is small, almost unremarkable, yet it marks a turning point. Rather than scandal, her declaration invites curiosity. The local physician, summoned to verify her claim, approaches with cautious respect. His report, measured devoid of moral judgment, notes that Mademoiselle Barbin is of an intermediate constitution, a phrase that enters the record without condemnation. Instead of erasing her, the town's officials consult with Parisian scholars, and within months, a quiet yet extraordinary decision is reached. Herculine will be allowed to amend her civil identity, not from woman to man, as in our true history, but to a new and unprecedented classification, intermediaire, a citizen of both designations. The newspapers take notice. Paris, ever eager for novelty, fills with debates. The journals of medicine and philosophy print essays with titles like "On the Third Sex" and "Nature's Hidden Harmonies." In this world, instead of ridicule, the case becomes emblematic of France's emerging dialogue between faith and science. Some theologians, inspired by her grace, argue that she represents the unity of creation. Others dismiss the notion, fearing blasphemy. But in cafes and salons, her name becomes synonymous with courage. She is not accused of deception, nor cast as anomaly. Rather, she is spoken of as the living question, a symbol of what it means to be both body and spirit, form and essence. Herculine herself remains humble through it all. She continues to teach, though now she writes in her journal under her full name, Adélaïde Herculine Barbin, and signs her letters with quiet pride. The children in her class notice no change, except perhaps that their teacher smiles more often. The villagers, after the first wave of curiosity passes, return to their lives. Life continues. Bread is baked. Sermons are delivered, and the small school by the river hums with learning. Yet something ineffable has shifted in the air, an invisible acceptance born not of ideology, but of recognition. In Paris, her writings begin to circulate in pamphlet form. An article titled "The Measure of the Soul" appears anonymously in La Revue Humaniste, but its tone is unmistakably hers, measured, luminous, filled with compassion for the human condition. "We draw lines," she writes, "to make sense of mystery, and then we mistake the lines for truth. But perhaps it is in the space between lines that humanity resides." Scholars discuss her words in lecture halls. Students quote her in debates about ethics and nature. Slowly, a movement begins to take shape, a quiet fellowship of thinkers who believe that identity is not a cage, but a continuum. Sarah, hearing of these events from afar, writes to her. The letter arrives one autumn evening, the paper scented faintly of lavender. "You have done what I only dared to dream," it reads. "You have named yourself in a world that fears names. Know that I am proud, and that your courage has become my compass." Herculine reads the words slowly, her eyes moist with gratitude. Though distance and duty separate them, the thread between them endures, thin, invisible, unbreakable. The Church, though cautious, does not move to censure her. Monsignor Duval, her old protector, now retired, sends a message through a mutual acquaintance. If the Creator's image is infinite, then who are we to limit its reflection? Such words, spoken from a man of cloth, travel far, finding their way into sermons and public discourse. Within a year, a minor proposal is raised in the Assembly to reconsider the legal definitions of gender in civil registration. It does not pass, but it sparks discussion, a beginning rather than an end. In the evenings, Herculine walks by the river near her home. The water moves in quiet currents, its surface catching the light of the setting sun. She reflects on what has changed, not just for herself, but for all those who might one day be spared the anguish of invisibility. She feels neither triumph nor fear, only an immense calm. For the first time, she senses that her life, once shadowed by uncertainty, has become a mirror for others to see themselves more kindly. As the year closes, she receives a letter from a group of young students in Paris who have read her essays. "You have taught us," they write, "that truth does not demand uniformity. We are learning to see beyond boundaries." She folds the letter gently and places it beside Sarah's. The world, though still uncertain, has begun to open its doors, and from hidden shame to printed word, a voice has emerged into daylight. The turn of the decade brought with it a strange, luminous stillness, as if the world itself held its breath. Herculine's name, once confined to modest school registers and discreet philosophical circles, began to drift into larger spaces. The salons of Paris, the pamphlets of reformers, even the sermons of those who sought to redefine virtue. Her writings, graceful yet unflinching, had begun to travel far beyond what she had ever intended, and in that distance, as often happens, clarity turned into distortion. What had begun as an act of courage now became the subject of fascination, debate, and at times, outrage. The year 1860, remembered later as the year of scandal, unfolded like a storm, slow at first, then suddenly all-consuming. It began innocently enough. A Parisian journalist, curious and clever but hungry for sensation, decided to publish an article not about her words, but about her life. He had obtained fragments of her letters, perhaps through some well-meaning acquaintance, and he wove them into a tale of intrigue, a tragic, romantic narrative of a hermaphrodite philosopher, torn between love and faith. The title alone was enough to stir the capital's imagination, The Two Natures of Mademoiselle Barbin. Within days, the paper sold out. Crowds whispered her name in cafes, not as a thinker, but as a spectacle. Some called her a miracle, others a moral threat. Yet in this alternate world where compassion had taken deeper root, the scandal did not bring destruction. It brought transformation. For every voice that mocked her, two rose in defense. Doctors, philosophers, even a few priests wrote counter-essays arguing that she represented not deviance, but the frontier of understanding. Her earlier essays were reprinted in sympathy, their words now carrying new gravity. Truth, she'd written, is not an act of conformity, but of courage. Those who read her carefully saw not sin, but sincerity, and for a brief, delicate moment, the scandal became a mirror through which France glimpsed its own contradictions. Still, the attention weighed upon her. In the quiet of her small house, she read the newspapers and felt both exposed and invisible. Her students stared at her differently now, some with admiration, others with unease. Invitations arrived from Paris, from literary societies and reformist groups, eager to display her as a living argument. She declined them all. Fame, she realized, is a form of distortion. "They do not see me," she wrote in her diary. "They see the shadow of their fears and desires cast upon my body." And yet, she did not retreat into bitterness. Instead, she began her most profound work, a series of essays titled "The Mirror Divided," in which she sought to untangle the moral threads of identity, truth, and compassion. In these essays, she asked questions that unsettled even her supporters. "If God is infinite," she wrote, "then is not every human form a partial revelation of that infinity? To deny another's form is to deny a part of God himself." Her tone was not rebellious, but sorrowful, measured, almost prayerful. The essays were serialized in small academic journals, but their impact spread far wider. A young medical student named Jules Rochard, who would later become one of France's early advocates for humane medical classification, cited her work as the reason he abandoned the language of pathology for one of personhood. As the debate swelled, Herculine was invited to Paris by a small circle of thinkers, among them early feminists, social reformers, and spiritualists, fascinated by her balance of science and faith. She hesitated, then accepted. When she arrived in the city, she found it as overwhelming as it was intoxicating. Gaslight gleamed on wet streets, carriages rattled over cobblestones, the air smelled of rain and ink. Paris in the 1860s was alive with change, railways expanding, printing presses humming, the old order trembling before a generation that no longer feared to question. Her first evening at a salon on the Rue Saint-Honoré would be remembered for decades. There, in a dimly lit room filled with the murmur of debate, she spoke not as curiosity, but as conscience. "The world has long believed that difference must be corrected," she said softly, her voice steady. "But what if it is not a wound to heal, but a lesson to learn?" The audience fell silent. Among them were writers who would later quote her, reformers who would shape laws, and skeptics who would, for the first time, hesitate before condemning. Still, scandal has its own gravity. Even as her words began to change minds, caricatures appeared in the boulevard papers, crude sketches mocking her form, insinuating that nature itself had played a joke. She ignored them outwardly, but in her private notes she confessed exhaustion. "To be seen too much," she wrote, "is another kind of blindness. They have made of me an emblem, when all I wished was to live quietly in truth." The Church, divided between compassion and caution, issued no direct judgment. Some bishops urged silence, others preached tolerance. A small pamphlet appeared anonymously, perhaps from one of her old mentors, arguing that the mystery of creation was vast enough to contain all variations. "If the stars do not protest the difference in their light," it said, "why should mankind?" Such words whispered in churches and classrooms softened the scandal's edge. Through all of this, Herculine continued to teach. Her students became her refuge, their innocence untouched by the storms of public opinion. She taught them Latin verbs and moral lessons, but also, subtly, the art of kindness. "To understand," she told them once, "is the beginning of mercy." Some of those children, years later, would remember her not as a figure of controversy, but as the teacher who listened, who never raised her voice, who taught them that dignity was not something one could give or take away. It was inherent, like breath. By the end of 1861, the scandal had begun to fade. New crises rose to claim the attention of the public: politics, war, invention. Herculine's name no longer appeared in the papers, except in the occasional thoughtful essay or letter of support. Yet beneath the surface, something irreversible had begun. The concept of a third category, though not yet law, had entered the vocabulary of progressive France. Young thinkers spoke of the spectrum of human form, of the unity of body and soul. Her courage had shifted the axis of understanding ever so slightly, and once such a shift occurs, the world can never fully return to its former alignment. As winter approached, she found peace in solitude. She moved to a small apartment overlooking the Seine, where she could hear the water's slow conversation with the stone embankments. Often she would sit by the window, pen in hand, watching the city lights shimmer like scattered prayers upon the river's surface. The sound of carriages below faded into the murmur of memory. Sarah's laughter, the bells of her youth, the gentle voice of Mother Therese, telling her that truth takes time to ripen. All of it lingered, not as pain, but as melody. She wrote one final line in her notebook that winter. "Scandal is only the shadow cast by truth when it first meets the light." Then she closed the book, placed it beside her lamp, and let the quiet of evening settle around her like a benediction. And through the ink, history itself began to bend. By the time the chill of the next winter settled over Paris, Herculine Barbin had become something more than a curiosity. She was a quiet force, a presence that drew others not by charisma, but by sincerity. The scandal that once threatened to undo her had paradoxically made her indispensable to a small but growing community of reformers, writers, philosophers, physicians, and women of education who sensed that the future was beginning to stir in their midst. They met in parlors and bookshops behind velvet curtains and under lamplight that softened the sharpness of debate. They called themselves Le Cercle Humaniste, the Humanist Circle, a gathering of minds who wished to imagine a gentler world, one that might reconcile science with compassion, reason with faith. It was here that Herculine found her truest companions, though she often remained at the edge of conversation, her words few, her silences eloquent. At the center of the group was the novelist George Sand, already a legend in her own lifetime, who greeted Herculine with the familiarity of recognition. "You carry both heaven and earth in your eyes," Sand told her at their first meeting. "The world will learn from you, if only it learns to listen." The two women became unlikely confidants, Sand, the famed defender of women's liberty, and Barbin, the quiet embodiment of nature's complexity. Their letters, exchanged over the years, would become small works of philosophy in themselves, reflections on solitude, on art, on the fragile balance between truth and acceptance. Among the circle were other figures whose names history would come to remember. Dr. Etienne Serre, who sought to humanize medical discourse, Madame Lemonnier, a feminist lecturer from Lyon, and a young journalist named Auguste Lemaitre, who would one day publish the first public defense of gender variance under the title Essai sur les formes vivantes. Together they debated not whether humanity could change, but how to persuade the world that change was not corruption, but growth. Herculine, always modest, offered perspective drawn from her own experience. "The soul," she told them once, "is not shaped by anatomy, but by the grace with which we endure it." Her words, spoken in a room filled with tobacco smoke and lamplight, silenced even the most talkative of the men. The salons were places of vivid contradiction. There were bursts of laughter, moments of fierce argument, and always the tension between the radical and the devout. Herculine moved through it all with serenity, like a calm current beneath a churning surface. She was not one to raise her voice. She taught by presence. In time, she became the quiet heart of the movement, a living proof that philosophy was not only to be written, but lived. When George Sand dedicated a small preface to her in a later edition of Consuelo, calling her a mirror of God's ambiguity, the phrase traveled through France like a blessing. Yet even in this acceptance, Herculine remained aware of the limits of her age. The new emperor, Napoleon III, had little patience for ideas that blurred order. Police surveillance of intellectual circles grew more frequent. Still, within the walls of those gatherings, hope persisted. The talk was of equality in education, of the dignity of women, of new laws that might one day recognize individuality as a right rather than an anomaly. Herculine began to give small lectures herself, not on identity but on ethics, speaking softly about the moral responsibility of understanding. She did not ask for recognition, only that cruelty be replaced by curiosity. Her talks, attended by young doctors and teachers, were written about discreetly in reformist journals. There was a night in 1863 that she would remember for the rest of her life. The circle had gathered in a garden near the Boulevard Saint-Michel. The air was cool, the scent of jasmine drifting through the iron gate. They had been discussing Darwin's newly translated Origin of Species, a book that unsettled many yet thrilled Herculine with its affirmation of life's endless variation. Nature, she said, holding the small book in her hand, is not a hierarchy, but a river. We are all its tributaries. A hush followed. Then Madame Lemonnier whispered, "Then perhaps what we call normality is only the quietest part of the current." There was laughter and a sense, fragile but real, that something new had entered the world that evening. The idea that difference was not a flaw but a form of wisdom. Still, not all encounters were kind. There were moments when her presence provoked discomfort, when even sympathetic men could not entirely free themselves from the gaze of curiosity. A painter once asked to sketch her portrait, insisting that her features represented a rare fusion of masculine and feminine beauty. She declined gently but firmly. "I am not a fusion," she told him. "I am simply myself." Such exchanges left her weary, yet she bore them without bitterness. Her compassion remained her armor. Those who came to mock her often left changed, subdued by the quiet authority that radiated from her restraint. In the midst of her growing influence, letters began arriving from across Europe, from Italy, Germany, even as far as England, each bearing the same note of wonder and gratitude. People who felt themselves out of place, people living quietly under false names, wrote to her for comfort. "You have spoken the words I could not," one letter from Vienna said. "Now I know that I am not alone." Herculine replied to each in her careful, rounded hand, offering not advice but listening. "To exist," she wrote to one woman, "is already to resist." Yet she remained human, and solitude still followed her like a long shadow. On evenings when the city lights glittered on the Seine, she would walk alone along the embankment, her cloak drawn close. She had friends, admiration, and purpose. But part of her still longed for the quiet companionship she once shared with Sarah, the laughter in the garden, the scent of lilacs, the touch of a hand unafraid. Sometimes she thought of writing to her again, but then she would hesitate, unsure whether reopening that tenderness might disturb the peace both had built in separate lives. And so she kept her memories folded away like pressed flowers, fragile, still fragrant, untouched. Her health, always delicate, began to waver during these years. The long hours of writing and teaching took their toll, yet she refused rest. "There will be time for silence when I am finished speaking," she told a concerned friend. Her final essay of this period, The Harmony of Opposites, published in 1865, became the quiet manifesto of her circle. In it, she proposed that humanity's strength lay not in purity or uniformity, but in its capacity to contain contradiction without collapsing. "The divine," she wrote, "does not divide light from shadow, it gives them both shape." When the essay was read aloud at one of their gatherings, there was a long pause after the final sentence. No applause, only the sound of rain tapping softly against the window panes. Then George Sand rose and said, "We have spoken enough. Let the world answer her now." The room fell into reverent silence, and in that silence something like understanding took root. Outside, the city glowed faintly through mist, its lamps reflected in puddles like scattered constellations. Herculine stood by the window, her breath clouding the glass, and for a moment she felt time itself pause. past and future folding gently into the present. She did not know how long this acceptance would last, nor what trials awaited her beyond the safety of that circle. But in the calm that filled her heart, she sensed that the truth she had lived for was no longer hers alone. It had entered the bloodstream of the age, subtle, yet unstoppable. And in the glow of reason, compassion flickered, still small, but unextinguished. The Paris of 1865 was a city shimmering with invention, its streets pulsing with the ambition of an empire that believed itself modern. Railways stretched outward like veins of progress, bridges arched elegantly over the Seine, and beneath that visible confidence, a quiet revolution of the mind was underway. Herculine, now in her late 20s, walked through this new Paris with a scholar's curiosity and a pilgrim's humility. Her essays had made her known among thinkers and doctors, who saw in her not a patient, but a peer. She was invited to speak before circles of physicians and philosophers, not as specimen, but as conscience, a living reminder that the human body could not and should not be reduced to categories of convenience. Her acceptance of these invitations marked the beginning of her next chapter, one where the realm of science became both her battleground and her home. At the Faculty of Medicine, she lectured on the ethics of classification, her tone calm, her words precise. She stood before men who dissected bodies as if the soul were an afterthought, and she asked questions that unsettled their certainty. "If anatomy reveals difference," she said once, "must morality follow it? Or shall we allow our ethics to grow beyond our instruments?" The hall had fallen silent, the scratching of pens momentarily still. For many young physicians, her words would echo for years, simple, unadorned, but impossible to unhear. Yet for all her composure, Herculine often felt the strain of inhabiting two worlds. The one of her birth still viewed her as anomaly, the one she helped create demanded from her endless explanation. To be visible was to be vulnerable. Letters arrived from every corner of Europe, some filled with admiration, others with hostility. There were those who saw her as a prophet of freedom, and those who branded her a corrupter of nature. She read them all without anger, noting only how fear and wonder so often shared the same handwriting. "Ignorance," she wrote to a friend, "is merely awe that has forgotten how to listen." Her relationship with the medical community deepened through an unlikely friendship with Dr. Etienne Serre, one of the leading anatomists of the time, who had once sought to classify human variation through rigid hierarchies of form. After attending one of her lectures, Serres approached her privately. "You have undone 30 years of my certainty," he told her, "and in so doing, you have restored my curiosity." He invited her to assist in the reform of medical ethics courses, and together they proposed the idea of le serment humain, a humane oath for physicians that emphasized respect for the living person over the pursuit of abstract truth. The idea was controversial, but it spread. Within a few years, the oath was adopted by several Parisian institutions, marking a quiet but monumental shift in how doctors viewed the bodies before them. During these same years, Herculine began to publish under her full name, no longer initials, no longer hidden behind philosophical anonymity. Her essays appeared in journals of science and law, always blending reason with tenderness, argument with reflection. "We measure the body," she wrote, "but fail to measure the harm of our measurement." Her prose, neither defensive nor militant, invited empathy rather than confrontation. It was as if she understood instinctively that the revolution she sought could not be achieved through anger, but through patience, by showing that compassion itself was a form of precision. Still, her nights were not free of doubt. There were evenings when she sat by her lamp, staring at her reflection in the darkened window, and wondered if she had truly changed anything, or merely distracted the world with her calm eloquence. "Words are only bridges," she noted once in her diary. "They are beautiful, but they cannot always bear the weight of crossing." In those hours of solitude, the old ache returned. the ache of being singular, of belonging everywhere and nowhere. Yet even then, she did not despair. Instead, she returned to her work, her pen steady, her handwriting immaculate, as if discipline itself could hold her together when the world could not. It was also in these years that she began to visit hospitals, not as patient, nor as curiosity, but as counselor. Dr. Serres arranged for her to meet with those whose lives, like hers, existed beyond the language of simple definition. Some were young, frightened, newly discovered by an unsympathetic world. Others were older, resigned to invisibility. Herculine did not lecture them. She listened. She offered neither correction nor consolation, but presence. "Do not allow shame to make you silent," she told one young patient. "Silence is the first wound. Truth is the beginning of healing." Those who met her often left transformed, not because she offered hope, but because she embodied it, quiet, unassuming, undeniable. Her advocacy began to reach legislators as well. In 1868, she was summoned to give testimony before a commission studying reforms to civil law. The officials, cautious and skeptical, expected rhetoric. Instead, she spoke of human dignity as something indivisible. "A state that demands falsehood of its citizens," she said, "cannot call itself civilized. Law should protect truth, not punish it." The minutes of that session would later be cited as the first recorded plea for gender self-declaration in Europe. Her words did not change the law immediately, but they planted a seed in the soil of bureaucracy, one that would not die. And yet, amidst her public life, Herculine still carried the memory of Sarah like a soft ache beneath her ribs. The letters had grown infrequent, the years heavy with distance, but each time a small envelope arrived with familiar handwriting, she paused all else to read it. Sarah wrote of her students, of her garden, of a life lived quietly yet not without joy. "I see your shadow in the faces of my pupils," one letter said. "You have changed the way I teach." Herculine replied with equal tenderness, though she never confessed how deeply those words reached her. She had learned, by now, that love, like truth, sometimes survives best when left unspoken. As the decade neared its end, Europe itself began to tremble. The winds of political tension carried whispers of war, and even the progressive circles that once nurtured her began to fracture under the strain of ideology. Herculine continued her work, but there was a new fatigue in her eyes, a quiet recognition that enlightenment always demanded its price. She had given much of herself to the cause of understanding, her privacy, her peace, her anonymity. And though she did not regret it, she longed, at times, for the simplicity of that small convent garden where the world's questions had once seemed distant and gentle. In 1870, as clouds of conflict gathered over France, she gave what would be her last public lecture at the Sorbonne. The hall was crowded, the air thick with anticipation. She spoke of the human condition as an unfinished symphony. "Each of us," she said, "is a melody searching for harmony. We must learn to listen not only to our own music, but to the dissonance in others, for that too is part of the song." When she finished, there was no applause, only the sound of collective stillness, the silence of an audience that understood it, had witnessed something both fragile and eternal. She descended from the podium slowly, her hands trembling slightly, and caught her reflection in a tall mirror near the door, a figure neither man nor woman, but entirely whole. For the first time, she smiled at what she saw. The healer had, at last, made peace with her own reflection, and at last the healer faced her own reflection and did not turn away. The summer of 1870 arrived heavy with the scent of iron and thunder. The air in Paris, once filled with the clatter of carriages and the laughter of evening promenades, grew taut with rumor and dread. The Franco-Prussian War had begun. What had once seemed like distant political tension now pressed against every doorstep. Trains groaned with departing soldiers, newspapers trembled in anxious hands. For Herculine, who had spent her life urging the world toward compassion, the return of cruelty in such grand and senseless form felt like a betrayal of everything she had worked to awaken. Yet as always, she met the moment not with despair, but with quiet resolve. When the first wave of wounded arrived from the front, the hospitals overflowed. She went at once to volunteer, her old friendships among the physicians opening the doors. The ward smelled of blood, ether, and smoke. The cries of pain echoed through the marble halls. Yet within that chaos, Herculine found a kind of purpose she had not felt for years. Here, anatomy was no longer theory. It was life itself pleading to continue. She moved between the cots with the calm efficiency of someone who had long ago made peace with the mysteries of the body. Soldiers did not question who she was. They only saw the steady hands that dressed their wounds, the low voice that soothed them into sleep. Sometimes, amid the exhaustion, she would pause by a window and watch the city smolder beneath the haze of distant artillery. She thought of the mirror at the Sorbonne, of the lecture halls now dark and silent. War, she realized, was the ultimate refusal to see humanity in the other. It was the physical manifestation of the blindness she had spent her life fighting in quieter forms. The wound of the world was the same as the wound within the self, an inability to reconcile difference with dignity. And so she worked tirelessly, as though by saving each life she might, in some small way, redeem the greater cruelty of mankind. It was during these months that her path crossed again with Sarah's. The hospital at Angers, where the retreating soldiers were being treated, had written to Paris requesting experienced volunteers. Herculine went without hesitation, and upon her arrival she found Sarah among the nurses, her hair streaked with early gray, her face worn yet luminous. Time had passed, but affection once kindled does not age, it deepens. For a moment they stood apart, unsure whether to speak as old friends or something more sacred. Then Sarah reached out and touched her hand, the gesture simple, inevitable. "So," she whispered, "you came." And in that instant the years of distance dissolved like mist. They worked side by side through that bleak winter, tending to shattered bodies and frightened souls. Their reunion was not romantic in the common sense. It was something quieter, older, beyond the reach of words. At night, when the wards fell silent except for the distant cough of the dying, they would sit together by a small stove, sharing tea, brewed from bitter herbs, speaking little. Sometimes Sarah would hum a tune from their youth, and Herculine would listen, eyes closed, letting the melody carry her back to the lilac garden of the seminary, to the laughter that had once felt like eternity. The war crept closer. Supplies ran low, and hunger became as constant as the cold. When Paris was finally besieged, letters stopped coming, and even prayer felt thin against the enormity of loss. In February of 1871, disease swept through the hospital, claiming the weakest first. Sarah fell ill soon after, a fever that burned through her fragile frame with merciless speed. Herculine stayed beside her, refusing to rest, reading psalms in a whisper, though her own faith trembled under the weight of grief. On the final evening, as snow fell softly against the window panes, Sarah looked up and said, "You once told me that truth is another name for love. Keep living in that truth for both of us." Then her breath slowed, and the stillness that followed felt vast enough to contain the whole of their shared past. Herculine did not weep. She sat in silence long after the body had been taken away, her hands resting on the folded blanket. Outside, the wind rattled the shutters like the turning of an unseen page. In that moment, she understood that every war, whether of nations or of identity, was a failure of imagination. The only true victory lay in kindness, in the quiet endurance of those who chose to heal rather than to harm. When the armistice finally came, the city celebrated, but she could not. The streets were littered with confetti and hunger, the people cheering victory while mourning their dead. Herculine walked through the crowds unnoticed, a small figure in a black cloak, carrying within her the echo of Sarah's voice. She returned to Paris to find the Faculty of Medicine partly in ruins, its windows shattered, its lecture halls filled with dust. Yet among the rubble she found something miraculous. One of her essays, The Harmony of Opposites, lying unburned beneath a fallen beam. The paper was smudged, but the words remained. She pressed it to her heart, as though the survival of that fragile page were a sign that her work was not yet finished. In the months that followed, she devoted herself once more to healing. But now her care took on a quieter, almost spiritual dimension. She began visiting orphanages and small clinics, speaking to women and children about patience, forgiveness, and the sanctity of difference. Her voice, though softer, carried more power than ever. She no longer sought to persuade. She simply bore witness to the truth of endurance. "We must learn," she told one group of nurses, "to see the divine in what we cannot understand. That is the only cure for cruelty." The memory of Sarah never left her, but it no longer wounded, it illuminated. Each life she saved, each child she comforted, felt like a continuation of the love that war had tried to extinguish. She began to think of mercy as a form of rebellion, the only rebellion worth sustaining. By the spring of 1871, as Paris slowly began to rebuild, Herculine would walk again by the Seine at dusk. The river moved with its old quiet rhythm, indifferent to the scars of battle, reflecting both the pale moon and the flicker of lanterns along the quay. She would stop at the same bridge where she once dreamed of possibility and whisper, "You were right, Sarah. Truth is love." The words would vanish into the wind, carried perhaps towards some other heart still searching for peace. And when the guns finally ceased, silence became her prayer. Spring returned at last, but it came dressed in mourning. The air over Paris still carried the scent of ashes and gunpowder, the memory of barricades and hunger lingering in every breath. The war had ended, yet its echoes filled the boulevards like restless ghosts. And in that fragile calm, a new France was being born, tired, wounded, but still dreaming of liberty. The empire had fallen, and the Third Republic began to take shape, cautious yet full of promise. Herculine walked among the ruins with a strange mixture of sorrow and purpose. She had lived long enough to see her country destroy itself, and now stood at the threshold of its renewal. Though weary, she did not retreat from the world. Instead, she saw in its brokenness a reflection of her own life, torn, misunderstood, but still capable of healing. Her lectures, interrupted by war, resumed in smaller halls, now filled with young students who hung on her words, not as curiosities, but as revelations. She spoke of reconciliation, of the need to rebuild not only the city's stones, but the hearts that had grown hardened by survival. Her voice had deepened, softened by grief, carrying a quiet authority that required no assertion. "We cannot rebuild a country," she told them, "until we have forgiven it." It was during these years that she was called again before the public eye, this time not as scandal, not as philosopher, but as witness. In 1872, the National Assembly began discussing revisions to the Code Civil, seeking to modernize laws that no longer suited a nation newly reborn. Among the many questions on the table was one that had haunted her entire existence: the legal definition of identity. For the first time, lawmakers debated whether a person's self-declaration could hold as much weight as a doctor's observation or a priest's record. It was an unthinkable notion to some, but there were a few, quiet, determined voices who had been moved by her earlier writings, men and women who had kept her words close during the long years of silence. When Herculine was summoned to offer her testimony, she hesitated. She had grown wary of public scrutiny, wary of being turned again into symbol or argument. But she went, understanding that silence, too, could wound. The assembly chamber was austere, its walls echoing with the murmurs of politicians who had seen too much war to still believe in purity. She stood before them, her hands folded, her expression serene. "You have rebuilt a republic," she began, "and a republic must be brave enough to trust its people. Let it be known that truth does not require permission." There was no applause, only the deep hush that follows the sound of something unmistakably honest. Her words did not become law overnight, yet they lingered. The proposal that followed, a modest amendment allowing for personal testimony in matters of identity, was debated fiercely, postponed, revised, and finally, in 1874, passed in partial form. It was not perfection, but it was a beginning. Citizens whose anatomy defied easy classification could now request recognition without condemnation. It was, by any measure, a quiet revolution. The newspapers mentioned her only briefly, calling her the philosopher of the in-between, a phrase she found both poetic and inadequate. Still, she smiled when she read it. For the first time in France's long history, the law had opened a small door where before there had only been walls. The change rippled outward. In the salons, people spoke more freely of selfhood, of difference, of the idea that one's truth might transcend the boundaries of birth. The church, though slow to follow, began to soften its rhetoric, framing diversity as a reflection of divine mystery rather than defiance. Medical journals began to use her terminology, intermédiaire, in place of harsher, dehumanizing labels. And in the cafes where ideas were traded like currency, young writers debated her essays alongside those of Hugo and Sand. She became, unwillingly, part of the intellectual fabric of a nation redefining its humanity. Through it all, Herculine remained the same, quiet, disciplined, inwardly luminous. She continued to teach, though now her classrooms were smaller, her voice gentler, her pace slower. The years had etched fine lines around her eyes, but her presence seemed only to grow more serene. When her students asked her about the law that bore her influence, she would smile faintly and say, "It is not my law, my children. It belongs to all those who have suffered in silence and still chosen to live with grace." She never claimed victory, for she did not believe in such things. Change, she often said, was not an event, but a long conversation between courage and time. Sometimes, on her walks through the Luxembourg gardens, she would pause beneath the chestnut trees and watch children play. Their laughter, free of shame or distinction, filled her with a hope she dared not name. She thought of Sarah then, not with grief, but with gratitude. The love that once seemed like defiance had become the root of her gentleness toward the world. She carried it still, invisible, but unforgotten, as one carries the memory of a song long after its last note has faded. In 1875, on the anniversary of the law's passage, she received a letter from one of her earliest correspondents, a young physician now teaching in Lyon. "Your courage," he wrote, "has changed the way I look at every patient. We no longer ask, 'What are you?' but 'Who are you?' and the world seems larger because of it." Herculine read the words slowly, her hand trembling slightly, and then she placed the letter beside her journal. For once she allowed herself to weep, not from sadness, but from the sheer, quiet beauty of having lived long enough to see kindness take root. That evening, as dusk spread over the rooftops of Paris, she lit a single candle and set it by her window. The flame danced gently in the breeze, its reflection trembling against the glass. Beyond it, the city glowed with the restless energy of progress. Factories humming, trains whistling, the pulse of a new century approaching. And somewhere within that restless brightness, she sensed the presence of every life that had been hidden, every truth denied, now beginning to stir awake. The candle burned low, but its light did not falter. It seemed to her then that perhaps this was what survival meant, not to erase pain, nor to triumph over it, but to remain luminous in its presence. One life had become a lantern for many. The years that followed unfolded with a kind of gentle quiet that only those who have lived through storms can truly recognize. Herculine Barbin, now approaching middle age, felt a soft exhaustion settling over her, a fatigue not of the body alone, but of the spirit. The great debates had slowed. Her name no longer echoed in the halls of politics or medicine. The law had changed what it could. Society had absorbed what it dared. And so, in the early spring of 1876, she left Paris, not in retreat, but in search of stillness, of space enough to listen again to the voice within that had guided her through every season of transformation. Her journey took her southward through the green slopes of Burgundy, across the lavender fields of Provence, and finally toward the shimmering light of the Mediterranean. The air grew warmer, the colors more forgiving. Each village she passed through seemed to exhale peace, the slow rhythm of rural life untroubled by the politics of identity or progress. In the small town of Apt, she rented a modest room above a stone bakery, its windows opening onto a square lined with plane trees. The days here passed like gentle prayers, morning light spilling across whitewashed walls, the distant bells of a church marking hours that no longer demanded achievement. She spent her days walking the hills, her notebook tucked beneath her arm. The countryside unfolded like scripture. Olive groves and vineyards shimmering in the sun, rivers murmuring through narrow valleys. Sometimes she would stop and sketch the curve of a tree or the reflection of clouds in the water, her lines simple, meditative. In this solitude, she rediscovered the patience of observation, the art of seeing without judgment. Once, as she rested by a river, she watched two children playing on the bank, a boy and a girl tossing stones into the current, their laughter carried downstream. She wrote in her journal that night, "They do not yet know that the world will tell them who they must be. For now, they are only themselves. And that is the purest state of grace." In the evenings, the villagers would gather outside the bakery, drinking wine and speaking of harvests, not politics. At first they regarded her with curiosity, the quiet stranger who read by lamplight and kept mostly to herself, but soon their curiosity turned to respect. They began to greet her each morning, to leave loaves of bread by her door. One woman, the baker's wife, brought her lavender honey and asked shyly if she might teach her daughter to read. And so Herculine began again to teach, though this time her classroom was not a hall of scholars, but a small kitchen, fragrant with yeast and warmth. She found joy in this simplicity, in the way the child's eyes widened at each new word, in the rhythm of ordinary kindness exchanged without ceremony. Letters still reached her from Paris, old friends writing of reforms, of progress, of how the city had begun to forget the sharp outlines of her story. She read them with affection but no longing. The urgency that had once propelled her had softened into reflection. "There is a time to speak," she wrote to one correspondent, "and a time to listen to what speech has left unsaid. I am now learning silence." Yet silence, for her, was never emptiness. It was a form of listening, to the wind through olive branches, to the rustle of life continuing unobserved. Occasionally she would visit nearby monasteries, walking their gardens with the monks who tended herbs and copied manuscripts. They found in her neither scandal nor saint, but a kindred seeker. One elderly friar, who had once studied medicine, spoke to her of the human body as a manuscript written in many dialects. She smiled and replied, "And perhaps holiness is simply the act of reading it without fear." The friar nodded, and they continued walking in silence beneath the cypress trees. As months turned to years, Herculine began to feel a subtle transformation within her, something beyond philosophy, beyond the need to explain. The bitterness of her youth, the hunger for recognition, the ache of injustice, all had dissolved into something softer, more enduring. She no longer wished to change the world. She wished only to live truthfully within it, and in doing so, to leave behind traces of gentleness where harshness had once prevailed. It was during one of her walks through the southern hills that she met a young artist, a painter named Léonie, who had come from Marseille to capture the Provençal light. The two women formed a quiet companionship, walking together through fields of poppies and almond blossoms. Léonie painted while Herculine read aloud from old poets, Ronsard, Lamartine, even fragments of her own youthful essays. They spoke often of perception, of how light and shadow shaped everything that was seen. A body, Herculine said one afternoon, is much like a landscape. It cannot be understood by outline alone. It needs the patience of sunlight to reveal itself. Léonie smiled and replied, "Then you have been sunlight for many who would have remained unseen." Their friendship brought Herculine a peace she had not known since Sarah's passing. There was no demand in it, no burden of memory, only presence. In Léonie's paintings, Herculine sometimes appeared not as subject but as suggestion, a silhouette walking along the horizon, a figure reflected in a stream. The painter once said, "I cannot paint you as you are. You change with the light." Herculine laughed gently. "That is all I have ever been," she said, "a change of light." By 1880, she had begun to write again, not essays, but letters and reflections she never intended to publish. She wrote of the land, of the patience of growing things, of the holiness found in ordinary lives. "The world," she wrote in one of her final entries, "is not healed by theories or decrees, but by the slow accumulation of mercy." These writings, discovered long after her death, would later inspire a generation of philosophers who sought to unite ethics and empathy. As summer ripened into autumn, the leaves turned gold along the river banks, and Herculine would sit beneath the same tree where she had first watched the children play. She would close her eyes and listen to the water, to the world breathing without hurry. Time, she felt, had become circular again, returning her to the same question with which her life had begun. Not what she was, but how she was meant to love the world that had so often failed to love itself. And as dusk gathered over the hills, she would rise, gather her shawl, and whisper to the fading light, "Every current, no matter how strange, finds its way to the sea." By the time the first chill of autumn touched the southern air, Herculine's world had grown very small and beautifully self-contained. The clamor of the century had receded into the distance, and her days unfolded like quiet sentences, simple but complete. Each morning she rose with the sun, brewed a cup of dark coffee, and wrote by the open window that looked onto the square below. The baker's boy would call up to her with a cheerful greeting, and she would wave in reply before turning back to her papers. Her handwriting, once formal and precise, had become looser, more fluid, less concerned with argument and more with evocation. The essays and reflections she composed now were not meant for journals or scholars. They were letters, addressed to no one in particular, sometimes to her younger self, sometimes to the world she had once tried to persuade. She called them her letters from the margins, because, as she wrote, it is from the edges that one sees the shape of things most clearly. In these letters she wrote of love and solitude, of the strange tenderness of being alive in a body that had defied the maps of its age. "I have lived," she began one of them, "between names, between certainties, between the pronouns of men and the silences of heaven. And yet, in that space of neither and both, I have found something vast, an understanding that kindness, not certainty, is what binds the world together." Her words, carried by a network of correspondents and former students, began to travel again, though she made no effort to publish them. They moved quietly, hand to hand, translated into Italian, English, even Spanish, by readers who found in them a wisdom untouched by time or bitterness. Letters arrived in return, dozens, then hundreds, from distant corners of Europe. Women wrote of their longing for freedom. Men confessed to living unseen lives. Priests and physicians spoke of the doubts that haunted their faith. Herculine read them all slowly, keeping each folded beneath a smooth stone on her desk. She answered as many as she could, her replies gentle, spare, often no more than a few lines. Do not be ashamed of your strangeness. The world is large enough to hold it, and sometimes suffering, when met with compassion, ceases to divide. It becomes the beginning of understanding. One winter evening, as the wind rattled her shutters, she received a letter postmarked from Paris, bearing the unfamiliar signature of a young philosopher named Lucien Valéry. He had discovered her earlier works in an old library and was astonished to learn she was still alive. His letter spoke of a new movement of thought among the younger generation, thinkers who believed that the boundaries of body and soul were questions of poetry as much as science. "You were a century early," he wrote. "We are only now learning to speak the language you were born into." His words touched her deeply, not because they praised her, but because they suggested that her time, which had seemed to her both too soon and too slow, might finally be arriving. She wrote back with modest amusement, "Every truth waits for its own season, as fruit does. I am content to have been its seed." These years in Provence were marked by a luminous quiet, a peace she had never dared to imagine. Her circle had expanded beyond the villagers to include travelers, scholars, and wanderers drawn by the rumor of a philosopher who lived like a hermit and spoke like a saint. They came to her small apartment above the bakery, students, poets, reformers, and left with notebooks full of her reflections. Some stayed for an afternoon, others for days, sitting by her side as she read aloud from her growing collection of letters. They called her La Lumineuse Recluse, the luminous recluse. But she never claimed wisdom. She merely insisted on gentleness. "Do not turn me into a doctrine," she told them once, smiling. "Doctrine is only the skeleton of experience. The living body of truth is compassion." Among her visitors was Léonie, the painter, who returned often, bringing sketches of the landscapes they had once explored together. She painted Herculine as she now appeared, silver hair gathered at her neck, eyes still bright, posture dignified yet softened by time. In one portrait, she depicted her friend seated at the window, pen in hand, a vase of lavender beside her, sunlight falling in bars across the paper. When she unveiled it, Herculine laughed quietly. "You've made me look like an old philosopher of Greece." Léonie answered, "Then the light must agree with me." Though age was beginning to weigh upon her, Herculine refused to succumb to fragility. She walked daily through the countryside, cane in hand, pausing to rest by the river that had once inspired her reflections on childhood. There, surrounded by reeds and dragonflies, she often thought of how life, despite its violence and confusion, always sought balance again, like water returning to calm after a stone's fall. "We are all ripples," she wrote in one of her final letters. "The shape may fade, but the movement continues." It was around 1883 that a small women's literary society in Geneva requested permission to publish a selection of her writings. She hesitated, reluctant to step once more into the public gaze, but finally consented, on one condition, that her work appear without preface or commentary. "Let my words stand without explanation," she wrote. "They need no defense." The collection, titled Letters from the Margins, appeared the following year in a modest print run, its cover unadorned, save for her initials, H.B. To the surprise of its publisher, it sold widely. The letters, blending philosophy and tenderness, resonated with a generation seeking meaning in a century that had raced too fast toward modernity. Newspapers called her the gentle skeptic, the philosopher of humanity's twilight. She ignored the noise. The only review she cherished was a letter from a young woman who wrote, "I read your words aloud to my mother, and we both cried. You made us feel less alone." As fame drifted near again, Herculine remained untempted. She continued to write privately, to teach the baker's daughter, to tend her small garden of rosemary and sage. Sometimes, at night, she would step onto her balcony and look up at the stars, those same constellations that had watched her since her birth in the convent far away. She would think of how her life had stretched between so many opposites, body and soul, love and solitude, visibility and obscurity. And yet, as she stood beneath that eternal sky, she felt only unity, a quiet assurance that all her contradictions had long since folded into one continuous story. The following winter was harsh, and her health began to wane. Friends urged her to move closer to the coast, but she refused to leave the place that had given her peace. "Let me finish my letters here," she said, "where the mornings are slow and the air remembers laughter." She continued to write until her hands grew too weak, dictating her last thoughts to Léonie, who sat by her side and wrote each word with reverence. "Paper remembers what the world forgets," Herculine murmured one evening. "That is why I write, to remind time of its promises." By the spring of 1885, her letters had traveled farther than she ever could. Copies circulated across Europe and even reached the universities of America, where professors cited her not as an anomaly, but as a moral philosopher. Yet she never saw herself as such. When Léonie told her of these tributes, she smiled faintly and said, "It is good that they remember the words. The person was never so important." That summer, as lavender bloomed once more on the hills, she sat by the river for what would be one of the last times. The water moved gently, carrying fallen petals downstream, and she whispered to herself, "Perhaps this is what it means to have lived, to have left behind something that continues to move." The wind carried her words away, scattering them like seeds into the vast, forgiving air. Paper remembers what the world forgets. When the letter arrived, its seal marked with the tricolor crest of the Republic, Herculine had already grown accustomed to the quiet of obscurity. She read it slowly, her spectacles perched low on her nose, the late afternoon sun slanting through the window. The government, it said, was preparing a grand exhibition in Paris to celebrate the progress of science and civilization, the Exposition Universelle of 1889, and her writings, once dismissed as marginal philosophy, had been chosen to be displayed in a section devoted to the evolution of human thought. Her name would appear beside essays on anatomy, morality, and the human sciences. She sat for a long while with the letter folded in her lap, the air humming faintly with the sound of cicadas. "Displayed," she murmured, half smiling, half weary. "After all this time, they still wish to put me in a glass case." Paris was no longer the city she had left behind a decade earlier. When she returned in the spring, the streets seemed brighter, wider, louder. The iron skeleton of the newly built Eiffel Tower rose against the sky, dazzling and terrible in its magnitude. Crowds poured through the boulevards, a restless tide of visitors from every corner of the world. To them, the future gleamed with machinery and invention, the triumph of steel and steam. Yet amid the din of progress, Herculine felt an ache of distance. The city that once trembled with ideas now pulsed with spectacle. The salons of thought had been replaced by exhibition halls, the pursuit of meaning by the pursuit of wonder. Her arrival caused quiet murmurs among the organizers who had assumed the philosopher was long dead. When she appeared, smaller than imagined, gray-haired, serene, they greeted her with a mixture of reverence and embarrassment. They had planned to display her portrait beside a medical chart of sexual anomalies, unaware that her life had been the very refutation of such categories. She listened patiently as they explained their intentions, then said softly, "If you wish to honor progress, remove my body from your diagrams. Place instead my words among your books." Her calmness unsettled them more than anger would have. The following morning, the exhibit was rearranged. Her essays were moved from the medical pavilion to the section on philosophy, where they stood between the works of Auguste Comte and John Stuart Mill. When the exhibition opened, she walked among the crowds unseen. Families marveled at electric lights, mechanical looms, and the colonial displays of distant lands. Children laughed, lovers strolled arm in arm, and everywhere the air buzzed with the optimism of a new age. Herculine moved quietly through it all, her cane tapping lightly against the marble floors. She paused before a glass case displaying a copy of her own letters from the margins. The pages turned to her line, "The body is not a prison, but a bridge." For a long time she stood there, watching the reflections of passing faces flicker across the glass. Some read the words aloud, puzzled, intrigued. Others moved on without a glance. She felt neither pride nor resentment, only a deep, distant tenderness for a world still learning to see. Later that evening, she was invited to a small reception for contributors. The room was filled with scholars, inventors, and dignitaries in stiff collars and glittering gowns. The air smelled of perfume and electricity. A young man approached her, bowing slightly. "Madame Barbin," he said, "your life has inspired an entire generation of thinkers. You are a symbol of the modern spirit, of liberation through knowledge." She smiled faintly and replied, "Liberation does not come through knowledge, young man. It comes through kindness. Knowledge without compassion is only another kind of blindness." He blinked, uncertain how to respond, and she touched his sleeve gently before turning away. Outside, the night sky was lit by the tower, a lattice of light reaching into eternity. The crowd gasped at its brilliance, but Herculine found herself watching the shadows it cast instead. "Every revelation," she whispered to herself, "risks being turned into entertainment." Around her, the air vibrated with applause as fireworks bloomed above the city, bursting like transient suns. She thought of her youth, of the quiet convent where she first learned to question, of the abbess who had told her, "Truth takes time to ripen." How strange, she reflected, that truth, when ripened, could still be misunderstood. The following days passed in a haze of attention. Journalists sought her out for interviews, but she refused them politely. "The words are enough," she said. "Let them speak for themselves." Yet she could not avoid the feeling that her presence had become part of a spectacle she no longer recognized as her own. People whispered as she passed, some with respect, others with curiosity. One evening, as she left the exhibition grounds, she overheard a woman say to her companion, "Is that the hermaphrodite philosopher?" The word, meant perhaps without malice, struck her like a forgotten echo from her youth. She paused on the bridge overlooking the Seine, the river glimmering beneath the electric lamps, and felt for a moment the old weight of difference pressing upon her again. But it passed. The river flowed on, indifferent to names and categories. Its music reminded her that every current, even the troubled ones, eventually merged into something greater. She stayed in Paris through the summer, visiting the exhibition often, not for recognition, but to observe the human theater it contained. The laughter of children near the machinery halls, the songs of foreign visitors, the hum of languages intertwining, these were her true fascination. She filled pages in her notebook with reflections not on progress, but on continuity. "We build machines," she wrote, "to mirror our hunger for perfection. But perhaps the only true progress is the slow enlargement of the heart." When autumn arrived, she returned to Provence, relieved to exchange the roar of the city for the silence of her garden. The journey back felt like descending from a bright but distant planet. In her absence, the villagers had tended her plants and aired her rooms. The baker's daughter, now a young woman, had placed fresh flowers on her desk. Herculine resumed her old routine as if no time had passed. Yet Paris lingered in her mind, not as triumph or disappointment, but as revelation. She had seen how easily truth could become spectacle, and how even the noblest ideas could lose their tenderness when displayed under too much light. That winter, she wrote one of her final essays, titled "On the Fragility of Understanding." It was short, almost a whisper of a text, reflecting on the danger of confusing visibility with comprehension. "To be seen," she wrote, "is not always to be known. The gaze of the world is hungry. It devours, it classifies. To love, however, is to see without hunger." The essay was never published in her lifetime. It would be found decades later, folded among her papers. The year closed quietly. She celebrated her 51st birthday with a handful of neighbors, sharing bread and wine under the glow of oil lamps. When they asked about Paris, she spoke only of the light, how it dazzled, how it trembled, how it faded into the same night that covered them all. And as she stepped outside that evening, she looked up at the stars and thought, with a faint smile, that perhaps even her own life had been an exhibition of sorts, one not of fame, but of endurance, of the soul's quiet determination to be seen truthfully, if only for a moment. Every revelation risks being turned into entertainment, yet even so, truth endures, hidden beneath the noise, waiting to be remembered by those who still know how to listen. The years that followed the great exhibition passed with a soft and deliberate quiet, like the gentle closing of a long, intricate piece of music. Paris faded once more into the distance, both literally and in memory, until it seemed to Herculine as though it had been part of someone else's life, an echo belonging to another time. In the small Provençal town where she had made her home, the rhythm of the days was slow, cyclical, forgiving. The seasons unfolded like verses from a familiar psalm. The vines thickened, the lavender bloomed, the rain came and went with unhurried grace. She tended her small garden each morning, the soil dark and cool beneath her fingers, her breath steady as she worked among the rosemary and thyme. Here, among growing things, she found the peace that the world of men and laws had never been able to give her. Her body had grown frail, but her mind remained luminous. Students and travelers still came to see her. Pilgrims of thought who had heard whispers of the philosopher who lived in solitude and spoke of the soul with the calm of one who had made peace with its contradictions. They would find her seated beneath the fig tree, a shawl wrapped about her shoulders, her gray hair caught in the light like threads of silver. She welcomed each visitor with the same quiet warmth, listening more than she spoke. Her laughter, when it came, was low and soft, like the turning of pages. Some brought books for her to sign, others brought questions. To all of them she offered the same advice, delivered not as doctrine but as invitation. Do not rush to solve yourselves. You are not a problem to be answered, but a mystery to be understood. Léonie still visited often, bringing with her paints and blank canvases. Together they would sit in the shade, one painting, the other writing. Sometimes neither of them spoke for hours. They simply shared the silence, the only language that seemed sufficient now. Léonie had taken to painting gardens, sunlight filtered through branches, the play of color on water. "You've taught me to see the spaces between things," she told Herculine one afternoon. "I paint what breathes in the quiet." Herculine smiled. "Then we are both gardeners, in our way," she replied. In the evenings, when the air cooled and the swallows dipped low over the rooftops, Herculine would sit by her open window and listen to the faint hum of the village preparing for night, the sound of dishes being washed, a child laughing somewhere, the creak of shutters closing. These ordinary noises comforted her more than any applause ever had. They reminded her that life, despite all its sorrow and striving, had an unbroken rhythm that endured beyond comprehension. Sometimes she would whisper a few lines to herself, the remnants of poems she had read long ago. All returns to the garden, where beginnings wait disguised as endings. Her correspondence continued, though she wrote less frequently now. Each letter she sent felt like a small farewell, a leaf carried downstream. "I no longer believe in legacy," she wrote to one of her old students. "It is enough that a few words once reached another heart. That is eternity enough." Many of her readers, scattered across Europe, had begun to call her Madame Harmonie, after her essay The Harmony of Opposites. The title amused her, but she accepted it with grace. It was fitting, she thought, that the world which had once feared her difference now found comfort in her balance. Her health declined slowly as the body's patience ran its natural course. Some days she could no longer hold a pen for long, her fingers trembling with the effort. Léonie began to write for her, capturing her dictations in careful script. These late writings were meditations rather than arguments, reflections on mortality, forgiveness, and the strange continuity between suffering and joy. "We think of peace as the absence of pain," she said one afternoon, her voice thin but steady. "But peace is simply the willingness to feel without fear. When we cease to resist our own being, life ceases to resist us." The villagers adored her. Children brought her flowers from the fields. Mothers came seeking counsel when grief or confusion weighed too heavily. She would listen, nod, and offer them a few words. Never instructions, only understanding. Every question, she told them, is already halfway to its answer if it is asked with love. They began to leave small offerings by her garden gate. Figs, lavender sprigs, hand-woven ribbons. She kept them all, not for their worth, but for the care they carried. The space around her home came to feel sacred, not by intention but by presence. As the decade deepened, the world beyond her garden grew noisier again. Machines, politics, the early stirrings of a century that promised both marvel and chaos. She read about it in the papers that arrived weekly but felt no envy for its urgency. "Progress," she wrote in her journal, "is only valuable when it grows roots deep enough to hold the soil of the heart." The modern world was learning speed, but forgetting tenderness. She hoped, perhaps vainly, that her words would remind some future generation that gentleness, too, was a form of courage. One spring morning, she rose before dawn and walked slowly to the garden. The sky was pale and clear, a thin ribbon of gold on the horizon. She leaned on her cane, breathing in the scent of earth after rain. A young vine had crept along the old wall overnight, its tendrils curling toward the first light. She smiled at the persistence of life, how it always reached, always sought the sun, no matter how many winters it had endured. "Perhaps," she whispered, "that is what faith truly is, the will to reach again." In those final years, she no longer feared the closing of her story. The thought of death did not trouble her. It seemed to her simply another transformation, another merging into the vastness she had always sensed but never named. "I have lived in between," she wrote in her final letter to Léonie, and it was enough. To have stood in the doorway of the world, seeing both sides, is to have seen all of it. As the summer of 1895 began, her strength faded rapidly. She spent most days beneath the fig tree, the hum of bees surrounding her like a gentle psalm. Friends visited quietly, sitting nearby without words, knowing that speech would have felt intrusive in the presence of such peace. One afternoon, as sunlight filtered through the leaves, she lifted her hand slightly as if to touch the air and whispered, "Listen, life still breathes." Her hand fell softly to her lap, her breath shallow but serene. Those who were near said it was as though she drifted into rest rather than death, as though the garden had simply absorbed her into its eternal rhythm. Even in stillness, life continues to unfold. Time, in the end, did what it always does. It softened the sharp edges of memory until all that remained was gentleness. 3 years passed after the garden had taken her into its quiet rhythm, and though the world moved on, its noise did not disturb the peace she had left behind. In 1898, a bundle of papers, weathered but intact, was discovered in the small room where she had written for so many years. Léonie, faithful to her friend's wish for simplicity, had kept them untouched, bound with a faded ribbon. When she finally opened them, she found not treatises nor essays, but something more intimate, a memoir written in the last months of Herculine's life in the slow, wavering script of an aging hand. The title, inscribed on the first page, was To Be Oneself. The manuscript was not long, but every line seemed to breathe. It was written not as confession, but as offering, a summation of the path she had walked between shadows and light. "I was not a miracle," she began, "nor a monster, as they once whispered. I was simply human, and that has always been the most difficult thing to be." From there, the pages unfolded like quiet meditations, a dialogue between her younger and older selves, between the child who had trembled under the convent's cold stone arches and the woman who had found peace in the warmth of a southern garden. "Each age," she wrote, "believes itself wiser than the last, but wisdom is not a ladder we climb. It is a circle we return to when we have learned to love our imperfection." She spoke with forgiveness for those who had wronged her, the priests who had forced her to hide, the physicians who had reduced her to anatomy, the journalists who had turned her into a spectacle. "They did not know me," she wrote, "and I did not know myself well enough to show them. We are all clumsy translators of the soul." She thanked her teachers, her friends, and above all, those who had listened without trying to correct her. "Kindness," she wrote, "was the only truth I ever trusted." The pages of her memoir were interspersed with fragments of poetry, reflections on love, and small recollections that might have seemed insignificant to others, but to her held the shape of eternity. She remembered the smell of chalk in the seminary classroom, the brush of Sarah's hand, the murmuring of the river near Angoulême, the laughter of children learning to read by the oven's glow. "The world," she wrote, "never forgave me for being both, but I have forgiven the world for knowing only halves." She spoke not of triumph, but of reconciliation, not of certainty, but of grace. In one of the final sections, she reflected on the word that had haunted her life: truth. "For years, I thought truth was something to be named, to be defined like a specimen in a jar. But now I know it is not a noun at all. Truth is an act of breathing. It changes shape as we live it, and it ends only when we stop drawing breath." The humility of that thought, its simplicity, revealed the full arc of her journey. From the frightened child whose body betrayed the expectations of her age, to the thinker who had helped that same age glimpse the boundlessness of being, her life had been an unbroken search for truth, not the kind found in books or law, but the truth that resides quietly within acceptance. As Léonie read through those final pages, she paused at a passage near the end written in a steadier hand, as though Herculine had saved her strength for it. "To be oneself," it said, "without fear, without apology, that is the purest prayer. And if there is a heaven, it will be the place where no one asks who you are." Beneath that line was a small mark, a dot of ink that might have been a period, or perhaps a tear. It was the last stroke of her pen. Léonie sat for a long time after finishing, the papers spread before her on the small wooden desk. Outside, the garden had begun to bloom again, the scent of rosemary drifting through the open window. She felt no impulse to publish or to preserve. She simply wept, not from sorrow, but from the recognition that her friend's journey had been complete, that her words had achieved what her life had sought: to speak without bitterness, to exist without disguise. Yet the world, as it always does, found its way to her legacy. When the memoir was finally published some years later, it was received not with scandal, but with reverence. Critics called it a work of quiet revelation, a mirror held up to humanity's own divided heart. The philosophers of the new century, seeking to understand identity and consciousness, cited her not as anomaly, but as pioneer. A few even called her the first voice of a future yet unborn. But for those who had known her, who had sat in her garden or heard her speak softly beneath the fig tree, she was never philosopher nor prophet. She was simply Herculine, a soul who had learned that love and truth, once united, could heal almost anything. In the years following her death, Leonie continued to live in the small house by the bakery, tending the same garden and writing letters to those who still inquired after her friend. On the 5th anniversary of Herculine's passing, she placed a simple stone at the edge of the river they had so often visited. It bore no name, only the words, "She lived between worlds, and so she embraced them both." And though the world would go on to forget many of its reformers, its revolutionaries, and its kings, the quiet wisdom of her final lines endured. Scholars would later say that her voice had anticipated an age of compassion yet to come, that her story, rescued from obscurity, had given language to the inexpressible. But perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps she had only shown, with her life and her pen, that the heart of humanity beats strongest in those who have known both its extremes. In that sense, Herculine Barbin had never truly left. Her garden continued to bloom. Her words continued to find their way into the hands of those who felt themselves unseen. In the stillness of every reader's breath, her prayer echoed softly across time, to live, to forgive, to be. Her story did not end. It changed form. When the 20th century opened its eyes, it did so blinking in the new electric light, dazzled by invention yet still shadowed by the old blindness of the heart. Empires trembled, machines began to roar, and the world, entranced by its own progress, rarely looked backward except to measure how far it had come. Yet somewhere beneath that forward surge, a quieter current continued to move, one that had begun long before in the small life of a woman who had lived between names. Herculine Barbin's words, preserved first by the care of one friend and then by the faith of a few readers, slipped through the cracks of time and took root in unexpected places. They were quoted in small journals, recited in classrooms, and translated again and again, their gentleness surviving each new language. For decades, her name faded and resurfaced, like the moon behind clouds, remembered not by the multitude but by those few who needed her most, the seekers, the doubters, the ones who sensed, as she had, that identity is both question and grace. By the 1920s, her writings found their way into the hands of early psychoanalysts and philosophers. Some tried to claim her as evidence for their theories. Others saw in her the refutation of all categories. Yet even when misunderstood, her voice persisted. "We are not contradictions," one scholar paraphrased her, "but continuities." Her reflections on compassion began to appear beside those of Tolstoy and Rilke. Her phrases slipped into the margins of modernist thought, her name re-emerging whenever the world grew brave enough to question its own boundaries. In 1936, a small French publisher reissued To Be Oneself, dedicating it to those who live unseen yet shape the soul of the age. The book sold modestly, but in the homes where it was read, it changed the texture of conversation. Teachers read her letters aloud to their students. Doctors cited her in arguments for patient dignity. And among women, especially those who had long lived in silence, her words became a kind of quiet anthem, that kindness, not conformity, was the true measure of humanity. Then came the wars, two vast, shattering tempests that swallowed generations. In those dark years, her name vanished again, her books buried beneath rubble and fear. But after each devastation, her voice returned, softer but undiminished. Soldiers who had seen the worst of human cruelty found in her diaries an unexpected tenderness. Refugees, scattered across continents, wrote her sentences in the margins of their prayer books. "We are all experiments in God's imagination," she had once written. "The tragedy is not that we differ, but that we are forbidden to be whole." In the ruins of Europe, those words found new meaning. By the middle of the century, when philosophy once again turned toward the study of self and power, her story was rediscovered by scholars who recognized in her not anomaly, but prophecy. They saw that her life had anticipated the questions that now consume them: how identity is shaped, how language defines and confines us, how compassion can resist the violence of definition. And so, in 1978, when a French historian named Michel Foucault published Herculine Barbin, being the recently discovered memoirs of a 19th century French hermaphrodite, the world met her again. Yet the world she entered this time was not the one she had left. The old shame had begun to crack, and people were learning slowly to speak their truths aloud. Her words, written in an age that had no vocabulary for them, became a mirror for the century's new search for identity. For some, she was a tragic figure. For others, a saint of ambiguity. But to those who listened closely, her message was neither sorrow nor spectacle. It was the same as it had always been, to live without fear, to love without disguise, to accept the wholeness of one's being as the quiet work of the soul. In the decades that followed, her influence grew in ways she could never have imagined. Writers, artists, and thinkers drew from her the courage to speak in tones both defiant and tender. Her phrases appeared in the margins of manifestos, in poems scrawled on the walls of cities, in the pages of books that sought to heal the long rift between body and spirit. Universities began to teach her not as curiosity, but as philosopher. In some circles, she was called the mother of identity theory. In others, the first modern mystic of the self. Her story was adapted for stage and film, her name invoked in discussions about the ethics of recognition and the language of love. Yet through all of it, through interpretation, revision, and reinvention, her essence remained untouched. The world continued to see her as it wished, but her truth, resting in the pages she had left behind, remained unbroken, serene, and whole. And so the centuries turned. Technology replaced parchment, voices crossed oceans in seconds, the boundaries she had spent her life questioning grew porous, sometimes mercifully, sometimes not. But still, somewhere in the quiet corners of libraries, her words waited. When a young reader, perhaps uncertain, perhaps lonely, opened her memoirs for the first time, they found not history, but recognition. "You are not wrong," her words seemed to whisper across the gulf of time. "You are simply more." The ink of her compassion did not fade. It continued to glow faintly through the paper, like embers that refused to die. Today, in our own century, we look back at her life not as a curiosity from the past, but as a mirror held gently before us. We see, in her courage to exist between names, a reflection of our own struggle to remain whole in a world that still prefers division. We see how easily progress forgets its prophets, and how essential it is to remember those who lived with honesty before honesty had language. We see that she was never truly alone, for every generation that comes after carries her question forward. What does it mean to be human, and how do we love one another in our differences? If she could see this age of voices, of declarations, of freedom mingled with noise, she might smile, perhaps even laugh softly and remind us that truth is still not a destination, but a breath. She might tell us that compassion, too, must evolve, that understanding must grow as endlessly as the river that once carried her reflection. She might remind us that history, for all its grandeur, is nothing more than the accumulation of small mercies between souls. And perhaps, somewhere beyond time, she still walks along that riverbank, her skirts brushing the wild grass, her face lifted to the light. Perhaps she looks upon this restless world with the same serene patience she once offered to her students and friends. And if we listen closely, beyond the machines, beyond the noise, beyond the endless naming, we might still hear her voice calm and luminous, carried on the wind like a prayer too gentle to die. To be oneself, without fear, without shame, without end, that is the beginning and the completion of love. And perhaps in some quiet corner of time, she still walks, free at last beneath her true name.